Hello and welcome in to the Fog.net podcast. My name is Michael Swain, the Kansas beat writer for 24/7 Sports, joined this Sunday evening, like I am joined every Sunday during the football season, by Kevin Flaherty. Kevin, a little later today, we're doing a little Sunday evening podcast, but how's the Sunday and weekend been for you?
It's been going pretty well. I've got this weird thing with my hands, though. It's something I picked up over the weekend. And I'm not sure if the viewers can see it, but this one hand, it's kind of stuck like in this motion right here, and the other one, it's like that. And so, one hand is just stuck on the 5, the other is on the circle, and it's kind of funny because we were talking before we started the podcast about how when we started this, we thought that there would be improvement this year, right? And we thought that this podcast would give us a chance to sleep on Saturday's game and come in the next day after a lot of times rewatching it, having a chance to actually sort of stomach what we saw and go on from there. Maybe highlight some areas for improvement where we saw them and things like that. I don't think either of us believed we would be sitting here on a Sunday, 5 weeks into the season, 5 Kansas wins into the season, and preparing for a week where a certain special somebody is going to be coming to the University of Kansas campus, for the game against TCU next week.
Yeah, it's a crazy time, and for KU fans, probably pretty exciting, right? You think about the last 13 years. I mean, we're at the point now where every game it's first time since 2009, first
Yeah.
time since 2009. And once you start getting into the first time since 2007, that's when you're really going to hit it. But for the time being, it's exciting and it's fun to watch and it's fun to cover as someone that, is a beat writer on the team and covering the team. And, the season goes by so fast when it's a successful team because you look forward to the media availabilities during the week. You look forward to the games on the weekend. You look forward to covering the game on a Saturday and Sunday evening. And I can't believe we're already heading into week 6. It's just beyond me. And it's been so fun to watch, but we'll hit some game day stuff later. We'll give our predictions for who's going to be the game day guest picker. Good list you can pick from. Good list to pick
Sure.
from. But let's start talking about the game, Kevin. 14-11, KU beats Iowa State. Ugly game. Lance Leipold joked about it after the game. Kind of a reporter mentioned that, oh, yeah, ugly game. And Lance like, oh, was it? Being sarcastic. And you can when you just won a game like that. And a game that I think it's one of those where Iowa State lost it. And and that's okay. It's okay to admit that too, because for a long time, luck has not been on KU side. And this was one of those times when luck was on KU side 100%. And I think back to maybe 2019, that Texas Tech game a little bit,
Yep.
where I with the missed field goal and how it worked out. I think it was a little bit like that, just a little bit of luck. And that's what you need in college football sometimes, right? You're dealing with 18 to 22-year-olds and, crazy things happen, and crazy things happened on Saturday for sure.
Yeah, and I think too, and we've talked about this, but we've seen Kansas lose this game too.
Oh, yeah.
Like we over the last 12 or 13 years. We've seen Kansas put itself into position where you're looking at it and saying things aren't quite going right, things are, the other team is hanging around, maybe you're still playing well. But at the same time, you're not pulling away as much as you should. And next thing you know, you're headed home with a loss where you're saying, well, gosh, if this went different or that went different, maybe things are, maybe things are different. Obviously, the story about that Lance Leipold told about, basically they're applauding me for playing a team close, that
Yeah.
we've got to change that as opposed to getting a win. You think about like the Oklahoma game last year in particular, Kansas plays well, didn't put Oklahoma away, even with how well they were playing. And it winds up being a game that even a couple weeks later, people are like, well, gosh, if Caleb Williams just didn't pull that ball away, KU wins it. And you wind up with the whole ifs and buts or candy and nuts. We'd all
Mm-hmm.
have a very Merry Christmas. And this is one where the ifs and buts went Kansas's way, and credit to credit to Kansas too, because, it was a game that was there for the taking, and also one that was there for the losing, and Kansas didn't lose it. So there's some credit on that one too.
Exactly right. And I think we have to talk about this game. I think chronologically, usually we take a big picture look at it and kind of talk about the big themes and storylines. But this was a game that had so many ebbs and flows and twists and turns. It was a little bit like that West Virginia game almost, right?
Yeah.
Where, first few minutes you're thinking one thing, and then a few minutes later you're thinking the other thing, and then it just keeps going back and forth. And this is one of those games. You look at the first couple drives, I thought we were in for a barn burner. You look at the way the two teams are moving the ball outside of, some penalties or a sack kind of stalling their first drives. But I just was looking at those first few minutes thinking, wow, these offenses came to play. And we'll talk about adjustments that were made a little bit later. But I think just, Kevin, for you, like, what stood out to you during the first few minutes? Because for me, I looked at Iowa State and said, wow, they're really going after KU's corners on the outside. And Hunter Dekkers is throwing a lot early on. And the running game wasn't really going. And Iowa State's lead running back, Jairo Brock, got banged up and didn't play a bunch. And then they had to rely on Deion Silas, who's an undersized running back, and Eli Sanders, who's unproven. So that stood out to me that they were throwing the ball a lot. And I think for KU was they were kind of moving the ball and getting what they wanted. There's a lot of play action. I thought, the pass to Jared Casey was an example of that. I just thought that KU came out with a really good game plan. I liked Iowa State's game plan, but I thought in the moment to start the game that KU's game plan was going to be more sustainable than Iowa State's.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think, coaches call that the scripted portion of the game, because they come in with, this list of plays that they're going to run for however many plays. Different coaches have different lengths on their script before they start going off script and calling a game, more organically by what they're seeing. Iowa State wanted to come out and they wanted to test the physicality of Kansas's defensive backs. Can these guys get off blocks and make a tackle? The other thing that I think they were testing was to see Kansas's sort of lateral speed. When you look at previous Kansas defenses, to be kind about it, they didn't run very well. And, when people would throw those little bubble screens or when they would throw just, the quick, hey, we've got 3 guys out here against your 2, Kansas didn't rally out there quickly, and so a lot of times that led to bigger plays. It made Kansas get guys out of the box, and then teams were able to run the ball. And I know this isn't an Iowa State podcast, but one of the things I've been a little surprised by is I do think Hunter Dekkers is a pretty good runner. He's got some physicality to him, and so I think that one of the things that I was a little surprised by was I thought Iowa State could have created some numbers advantages as well by including him in a little bit more quarterback run game, doing some zone read. But they haven't done that much this year coming in. But if you looked at like what Iowa State was doing and what Kansas was doing, and this is to your point, Kansas looked a lot more like Kansas with what it was doing than Iowa State looked like Iowa State. Like Iowa State felt like it was playing outside of itself to throw the ball that much. And that's why I think it felt like it wasn't as sustainable. Whereas Kansas, you're like, well, okay, this is what Kansas likes to do. This is what they've been doing. It was a good script, but at the same time, it felt like, okay, which of these teams is going to be able to still do this in the third quarter? You felt like maybe that was Kansas.
Exactly. And I think you saw the success in the first half. Now, you take advantage of a really poor interception from Hunter Dekkers, a really incredible interception from Kobe Bryant. I need to get better at that. I just look at him making big time plays. And this is something that Caroline Soro and I talked about in our kind of post-game wrap video podcast deal after the game was whenever KU needs a big play, Kobe Bryant is there and he tends to make it. And we'll talk about his play later in the game, but then you take advantage of kind of that short field. And that's what you have to do against Iowa State. Iowa State's a team that is hard to drive against consistently.
Yep.
So if they give you the ball that close to the end zone, you have to punch it in for a touchdown. If you get a field goal there, obviously you're losing the game in hindsight, but like just in terms of feeling, you're feeling, wow, that's a huge missed opportunity. And so I look at early on, KU was able to move the ball and having success. You look at the first half numbers, KU averaged 6.5 yards a play, which is really stinking good. And that's what you want out of your offense. Obviously it's not some of the numbers that they had earlier in the season against like West Virginia or Houston, but those defenses are not as good as Iowa State's. If you average 6.5 yards per play against this Iowa State defense for a whole game, that's incredibly impressive. And so you look at halftime, right? 14-8. You're kind of feeling, all right, KU should probably be up by more. And if they aren't, they need to come out, because remember, they get the ball out to start the second half. They need to come out and score immediately to try and not put the game away, but put it in a spot where then all of a sudden Iowa State really has to press. And golly, you mentioned Hunter Dekkers. Like, I'm a big Hunter Dekkers fan. I think he'll be a really good quarterback in 2 years or a year and a half.
Yeah.
But not right now. That was pretty dire. And you looked at that saying, if you have to make Hunter Dekkers throw because they're down 21-8 for the whole second half, you feel pretty good about that and your defense's ability to tee off on that. We'll talk about the defensive line later because I have a lot to say about those guys. So for you then at halftime, what was the vibe like for you? Obviously, I'm sitting in the press box talking to people, chatting with some Iowa State folks. And, the vibe around the Iowa State Riders was, man, that was a bad half of football from Iowa State. And I think that they kind of had the same feeling that, man, this is a game that if Iowa State doesn't get it corrected, could get out of hand.
Yeah, and I think the flip side of that is looking at it from the Kansas side, you felt like it should be out of hand,
For
right?
sure.
And I'm not saying that, Kansas should have had 35 points or anything like that, but I am saying you're looking at 14-8 at that point, if you're Kansas, as a missed opportunity because you feel like you outplayed Iowa State to such an extent. And it's funny, I feel like every single week, and we'll talk about the defense, and the defense was terrific. But every single week we talk about explosive plays, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was the thing with the Cyclones was Kansas defended so well, and it looked like potentially was going to even head into half with a shutout. You allow the big throw, the big explosive play that gets Iowa State right down there and gives them a chance to take a serious bite out of that lead. And so I think that, from a Kansas standpoint, you're still leading, but you felt like, okay, I don't like the way that half ended. And I don't like the fact that Iowa State is still here and not multiple scores back.
Yep.
And Kansas was getting the ball to start the second half. So you felt good about that part. But generally speaking, you felt kind of like, okay, Kansas is potentially in a danger zone here in a different way than Iowa State. Like you said, if you're Iowa State, you look at that first drive of the second half is really important because if Kansas goes down and scores a touchdown, it's 21-8. Not that you're behind the 8 ball, but you haven't moved the ball well. You're in a real dangerous spot.
Yep.
But from Kansas's standpoint, you're up 14-8. If you don't do anything with that first drive and you're punting the ball back to Iowa State, all of a sudden you're saying we're one play away from trailing this game that we have outplayed this other team in. And so I do think that from Kansas's standpoint at halftime, you're feeling, Iowa State's is almost like, woo, that was a bad half, but we're still there. Kansas's standpoint is that was a good half, but they're still there.
Yeah. Not perfect also, right? You look at KU, it wasn't perfect. And that's the thing that was also kind of encouraging because I think the offense kind of has been pretty close to perfect most of the season, right? The Duke game, a little hit or miss at times, but then you get in the second half. And I wish I maybe pounded the table harder during the game on this, but, John Haycock, the defensive coordinator for Iowa State, is incredibly smart. And you spend time around that program, and I think you learn how he approaches a game where there's a feeling out process. It's kind of like boxing, where you watch like a title fight. In the first couple of rounds, it's not the guys throwing haymakers at each other. It's a lot of kind of feeling each other out, kind of get the jab going, and that's what John Haycock does in the first half and really the first quarter of games. And what I thought you saw in the second half is classic Iowa State football. They make really good adjustments. KU, I thought, had some success with some of the option stuff and some of the design runs. And all of a sudden, in the second half, that was not there. And I think that's a credit to Iowa State. We'll talk about more KU stuff in a second, but that's what I expected. I expected Iowa State to be better in the second half defensively because that's who they are as a team. Now, what I didn't expect was that from KU offensively, right? You look at the numbers. They ran 20 total plays in the second half. 20. That's it. Iowa State ran 42. And KU averaged 2.2 yards per play. That's
Yeah.
awful.
Yep.
Awful. So I'm curious for you, Kevin. I've seen a lot of the discourse about this, and we'll do some more big picture offense stuff after. But what do you think of the play calling? Because I saw some folks maybe weren't overly thrilled with that. What do you think about it?
Sure. I did think that there were parts where it seemed like Kansas went conservative. And you
Hmm.
look at when you're facing, third and long and you have Jason Bean carry the ball, when Jalen Daniels, and I'm not saying Jalen threw the ball well against Iowa State. He would tell you he didn't throw the ball well against Iowa State. But with the way he's thrown the ball this year, third and 10, third and 12, that's not an auto punt. That's a pretty, that's a pretty convertible down with the way that he's played. And so to take the ball out of his hands in those situations, I thought was maybe a little bit conservative. Now I will say something that you saw after the game where Lance Leipold talked about, well, Jalen missed some reads. He was trying to do too much. And that wasn't just in the passing game. And I think it's important to note that when we're talking about Kansas going conservative,
Mm-hmm.
because it looks conservative when you run the ball and you get stopped for no gain or for a
Yeah.
2 yard gain. It doesn't look conservative when you make the right read and a guy breaks something for 15 yards. And I think as much as we were looking at it in real time and saying, my gosh, why is Kansas running the ball? I think there were some openings and some plays that maybe they left on the field there that had those played out, had the right read been made. You even look into the passing game, Quentin Skinner is running wide open for a touchdown. And it feels like Jalen has hit all of those
Yeah.
this year. And like you were saying, it does feel to some extent like Kansas has been perfect in previous games because Jalen hasn't typically missed throws like that. But if you change a few of the run game reads around, where all of a sudden those are a little more successful.
Mm-hmm.
And because you're getting more first downs, you're getting more plays. You don't only have 20 plays. If Jalen hits Quentin Skinner on that ball, I think a lot of the criticism goes away, or at least is different. I don't think you feel like Kansas was as conservative as it looked like on first watch, and
Yeah.
so I think that's kind of what I took away from it. What did you think about play calling it, and what did you see?
KU's had a lot of success with a specific identity so far this
Yep,
season, right? It's been some of the option stuff. It's keeping defenses off balance. And a part of that has been getting in really good third and manageable situations,
sure.
really good third and manageable. And so I look at the play calling, and I didn't think it was any different than any other game. I don't think it's one of these deals where all of a sudden KU changed the way it approached things. They approached it the same way. They just played a better defense. And it's
Yep,
a defense that had better individual players to make plays, right? Here's a really good example that I think of when I think about this game. There's that run Jason Bean had to the right when on the TV screen you're going right to left, and so he goes to the far sideline, and it's like a 3rd and 8 maybe, and
yep,
you're thinking, okay, they're going to run the ball with Bean to the outside, and Colby Reeder, the linebacker for Iowa State, just makes a really good play.
yep,
You just got to kind of hang your hat, right? Earlier in the season against Duke, against West Virginia, against Houston, Jason Bean probably gets to the edge, and all of a sudden now you're looking at a 4th and 1, not a 4th and 4, or whatever it was in the end. And so I look at the play calling, and I just don't think it's not that different than what we've seen from them in the past. And I just I can't get up in arms about it, right? You can't kind of have it one way and then all of a sudden expect it to be another way. So I look at it that way, and I just can't get super up in arms about it. Was KU conservative on 4th down? Sure. Yeah, they were. But they also played the field position battle. And so if you want to do that, right, you look at kind of the overall drives for KU, and they certainly won the field position battle, right? They start on average at their own 37. Iowa State starts on average on their own 26, but you pinned Iowa State inside the 20 on 4 occasions. So, I mean, overall, I'm kind of like, you made Iowa State go the long way. And so it's just hard for me to get super upset about it or be like, oh, Andy Koldenek, you really messed this up. It's kind of like you just played a better defense, and that's okay. And I think you look at the third downs too, right? For a lot of the year, it's been 3rd and 3, 3rd and 2,
yep.
you know? Well, on average against Iowa State, they had 10 third downs, and it was an average gain of 7 yards to go. That's a lot harder of a situation. It's a lot harder to call plays. Or on the reverse, right? We've heard Brian Borland talk about this a bunch. As a defensive coordinator, it's really hard to call plays when it's 3rd and 1, 3rd and 2, 3rd and 3. It's really easy to call plays when it's 3rd and 7 and more. And so I think you just saw the kind of the flip side of that, where KU was able to keep Iowa State at 3rd and long, but on the other side, they really couldn't get out of 3rd and long.
Yeah, and we talked, coaches talk a lot about teaching tape, right? Like it basically that's a nice way to say that you didn't do what you were supposed to do. And because of that, it's tape to teach off of. And I think when we watched the Tennessee Tech game, one of the things that we had said was there were plays that Kansas made in this game that it made because Kansas was playing against Tennessee Tech, right? You didn't have to be perfect. Your helmet didn't have to be in the exact right spot when you were blocking somebody to get the right angle. You didn't have to attack this leverage the exact right way in order for it to work. Against Iowa State or a defense like that, and I'm not saying Iowa State is Georgia, but against teams like Georgia or teams that have really good defenses, you have to be perfect. You have to make that block with the right angle. And if one guy doesn't do his assignment correctly, if he misses even a little bit, that's where you can see Will McDonald all of a sudden beating a guy because Will McDonald is really, really good. And so I think that your point about the defense is really apt. And I thought, the term genius gets thrown around too often in coaching circles, but Haycock is a really smart guy. And you talk to Brent Venables, who's one of the best defensive minds in college football. Mm-hmm. And even Venables said at Big 12 Media Days, and I know you were there for that he had the number 1 defense in the country at Clemson, and he went and watched Iowa State for how to defend the spread. And the very next year, they had, I think, a top 5 defense again. I think they were number 3. But anyways, like when Clemson, which is winning national titles and has all that talent, and Clemson's defensive coordinator says, "Now wait a minute, like this guy's doing it better than we are."
Yep.
Like that has to tell you something. And so I thought Haycock did a nice job of kind of showing Jalen some different things that maybe he hadn't seen that messed with those reads. I thought even beyond that, Iowa State's got some really good defensive players, and they're going to be a fun team going forward. I know you and I have talked about it. They've got a lot of young talent in Ames, especially on that defense, and those guys are going to start rotating through a little bit more. And so Iowa State getting them, on October 1st is probably a little bit better than getting them on November 23rd or whatever. And so I do think, a lot of the stuff that you were talking about, you have to be more precise when you're playing a really good defense like that. And the things we were talking about, Jason Bean has the run in the first quarter. Jared Casey gets flagged for holding. I think it was a bad call, but I'm not here to blame the refs. I'm just saying that would have made a first down. Kansas maybe scores a touchdown on that drive based on where the ball is. You get 7 points. Mm-hmm. Quentin Skinner running all by himself. Jalen Daniels misses that throw, 7 points. All of a sudden, those are the plays that you didn't make for whatever reason, whether it's a call, whether it's, you miss a pass, whether you miss a block by a little bit. If Kansas would have come out of that game yesterday with 28 points, I think all of us would have said, great, you did your job against that Iowa State offense. You put yourself in a position to win by double digits.
Yep.
But that's how precise you have to be to score 28 instead of 14. And so I do think that there's a lot to be said for the fact that Kansas is just facing a really good defense.
Exactly. And so I'll weave in a question here a little bit, and we'll discuss it a tiny bit. But what did Iowa State do differently? I just think they're better. They're better coached. And so what I look at here with Iowa State, you look at, I talked about it with Nick Osen maybe on our preview podcast, but you look at their defense, right? Their 3 linebackers have all been in the program for multiple years, right? Colby Reeder's a new transfer, but he's familiar with the defense and knew it going in. He's someone that I talked to during his recruitment, and he was like, yeah, I know the defense. So you're looking at the linebackers, and that's a crucial position against KU's offense, right? Because those linebackers have to be in the right spots to stop those option plays. And it seemed like they were. And then, okay, cool. Let's look at the defensive line. Great. You have Will McDonald, who could go down as the all-time sack leader in the Big 12, right? Then you've got a guy like Isaiah Lee, who's been in the program for a while. All right, cool. Let's go to the secondary. Well, their two corners are the two most talented guys KU's gone up against all year. Go back to safety. You've got high-level true freshmen. And that's the crazy part about Iowa State right now. They've got a lot of true freshmen. A lot of guys that I know because I covered their recruitments. And all of a sudden I hear their name called, and you're like, wait, what? This true freshman's playing? And so it's just like that where they've got young guys that are talented and they're well coached. And it's just different. We've talked about in the podcast, right? Houston was not disciplined. West Virginia's secondary was atrocious. Duke was the more disciplined, but had less of a talent in terms of defense. So this is just the best test KU has played so far, and they just weren't that sharp, and it's fine. It's one. We'll hit on the long-term stuff later at the end of the podcast, but for right now, what did Iowa State do differently? It's a tough defense to go against. They played really well, and they're just well coached. And so I don't think this is anything where it's like Iowa State, they have the playbook to stop Kansas. No, because not everyone has the dudes that Iowa State has and the dudes that are coaching those players too. And so that for me, it's not necessarily what did they do differently scheme-wise. It's just kind of you encapsulate it all together. And I think you saw KU not execute, right? Be a step off for the first time this season, but also just going against a much better team than they've played so far this year.
Yeah, I think when you look across the Big 12, the only other defense that presents similar problems, and I'm not saying it's the other best defense, but the one that plays similar stylistically, and has some of the same issues is Baylor. And when you're pointing to this and saying, well, this means when KU plays better defenses, they won't be able to do. No, I don't think that that's fair, because I think that one of the things Iowa State does so well is they make it really hard for your 5 offensive linemen to block their 3 defensive linemen.
Exactly.
And that frees up the other 8 guys to do whatever Haycock wants them to do, whether that's, being in the right position for option stuff like you were talking about, whether that's dropping 8, whether that's sending an exotic blitz because you can't tell where those guys are coming from. They start with those 3 up front, and that's the base, and they can eat up your blockers and they can beat your blockers with those 3. And like I said, I think, Baylor is another 3-man front that presents some similar challenges. But I think other than that, you look across the Big 12, and not that there aren't other good defenses, but the one that's most like maybe what Iowa State could present would be Baylor. And you're just not going to face that very often. And so I do think that when you add in, Haycock and Dave Aranda, 2 of the best defensive minds in the conference, Baylor's maybe the other team that you would look at on Kansas's schedule and say, okay, this is going to be the team that's maybe going to be able to tap into some of the same things that Iowa State did. Other than that, I mean, Iowa State entered the game as the Big 12's best defense for a reason. And I don't know if they're going to finish the year as the best defense, but they're going to be up near the top, I would almost guarantee. I mean, they're good from a personnel standpoint. Like you were saying, they have guys who are still getting experience, so they're going to be better later in the year. And even so, I think watching that defense yesterday, I think I saw 5 or so guys who popped as possible all Big 12 guys this year. And I just don't think there are a lot of teams that bring sort of that package to bear.
No, not at all. All right, so let's go to defense now. I'm going to try not to get too fired up talking about this, but the defensive line was awesome. That was as dominant a performance from a defensive line that KU's had in, I think, as long as I can remember. Iowa State's offensive line is not bad. You look at the 3 interior guys, or 3 starters, and 3 guys that are multi-year starters, and guys that would start at other programs. I think the right tackle had a bad day, but that offensive line is good. And you saw KU's defensive tackles, defensive ends go out there and kick tail for 4 quarters. It was nonstop. You saw the rotation. You saw different guys come in, and it did not matter. Tommy Dunn came in and literally knocked a guy off the ball as soon as he came in. And it's like, okay, this is a redshirt freshman who's doing this against Daryl Simmons, who's a multi-year starter for Iowa State. And it just is so cool to see that you go back to the start of the season. What were we worried about? The pass rush. Who else can create pressure other than Lonnie Phelps? You look at the first couple weeks, what we talk about. They got it at times, right? Against West Virginia and Houston, they got pressure at times, but it wasn't great. And then there wasn't a ton against Duke. And then you go this time and you look at the pressure numbers, and Hunter Dekkers was pressured once every 4 dropbacks. It's just impressive. And so I look at that unit, and I think that's where the defensive performance started. Because if Hunter Dekkers had time to drop back and survey the field and see everything and make plays, he would have made plays. Because I think Iowa State's wide receivers were able to get open. You saw that with Hutchinson and Staley, that they were able to get open and make catches. And so it's just cool to see the coaching over the course of weeks show itself in a game. Because how often has that been the case? It's not like, how many years has it been for KU where there's an issue in week 1 and it's still an issue in week 12? And there are other issues with the defense, sure. But this is one that they have now progressed week over week and gotten better and better and better. Shout out to Sam Burt too. 1.5 sacks, his first career sacks. The dude's he's a super senior, and he just got his first career sacks. I think you look at Taiwan and Atolu, you look at Brian Borland, you look at Jim Panagos, those 3 guys deserve a ton of credit for what they've done with this defensive line to where you can go and pressure Hunter Dekkers on 14 of his whatever dropbacks. I think it's 54 dropbacks. And they got a total pressure number of even more than that. So I just think the defensive performance, if we're going to talk about it, it starts right there.
Yeah, I think so. And when you look at how DJ Withers played against Duke and Tommy Dunn now, that's a pretty exciting young position group all of a sudden for Kansas. And I know we talked about that before the season even started, where we said it'll be really interesting when these guys start rotating in, because even Quan Drake, before he left, had said, I'm very interested to see how these guys start to pan out. And you're starting to see them rotate through it, and you're seeing less and less, like you were saying, of a drop off between the top guys and when they bring in a DJ Withers or a Tommy Dunn. I look at it this way too. I think that was Lonnie Phelps' best game as a Jayhawk. When you look at adjusting for competition, obviously Tennessee Tech, he was living in the backfield, but it was Tennessee Tech. But adjusting for competition, I thought that was Lonnie Phelps' best game of his career. Sam Burt, you said, was a super senior. I think he's like a super duper 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 senior. Like he was on that 2007 team, so he hasn't quite been there that long. But it was the best game of his career, and I'm not sure it's entirely close. And yet you look at, Malcolm Lee had some great moments. Jeremy Robinson had some great moments. Caleb Sampson had some great moments. And every time it seemed like Kansas got initial pressure and forced Dekkers to move, there was a second guy there. And that's what we were talking about before the season started, was we said, Lonnie Phelps is really good. He is a proven player on College Football Saturdays. He is going to generate pressure. But if he's the only one, and that was what we saw last year with Kyron Johnson would dust an offensive tackle, and there wouldn't be anybody to clean up the play. And how many times yesterday was it not the first guy that got the sack or got the quarterback hit or whatever? It was somebody chasing Hunter Dekkers into somebody else who had also beaten their block. It was really encouraging to watch. And the other thing that I would say too, defensively as a whole, but also looking at the defensive line and the pressure, not everybody's a big fan of Pro Football Focus, but one of the things that they look at are turnover-worthy plays. And while Dekkers had the one interception, he had the other interception that came out on the ground, Michael, there were maybe 5 or 6 other throws that were turnover worthy throws where he was pressured into making a quick decision, getting the ball out, whatever. And the DB didn't see the ball. The DB didn't quite get there quick enough, whatever reason, you're looking at a potential turnover and looking at that part of it and the field position battle that you were talking about. I'm sure that at some point Kansas felt like, hey, if we pin Iowa State deep, they're not going to drive the length of the field on us. And we might be able to generate a turnover because of all these turnover-worthy plays that are happening. Kansas was unlucky to only have the one interception because that was a game when you look at the throws that Deckers made, Kansas could have come away with 4 or so interceptions in that game without too much imagination. And I think that all, again, goes back to that defensive line group. I mean, it was just a marvelous, marvelous performance.
Yep, and turnover-worthy plays, Deckers had 5.
Yep.
5. And that's including the interception. So you are right. They could have gotten, okay, you're not going to get all, you're never going to intercept every interceptable ball that you ever get. But, that was impressive. And so I think, too, let's talk about the linebackers because obviously there's some news here. Gavin Potter is no longer with the team. Not super surprising, if I'm being honest here. You look at his role on the team compared to what it was last year, right? Last year, he's one of the guys that played the most snaps. All of a sudden, they bring in a bunch of new transfers. Potter was playing, right? You saw him on defense. He was out there, but the 4-game rule. And it makes sense, right? Players have every right to think about their best interests, and that is A-okay. So he's played in 4 games. If he decides to transfer and continue to play college football, he will have 2 seasons of eligibility remaining. I thought it was interesting what KU did in his absence because he was backing up Craig Young at that Hawk position. What they did instead was they moved Taiwan Berryhill from the weak side linebacker spot. They moved him to Hawk, and then they had Lorenzo McCaskill come in and play the will linebacker position. And this, again, goes back to the depth. You've got a guy that is a multi-year starter at Louisiana, has played over 1,000 college football snaps. He is the first guy off the bench for you, Kansas. That's big. And I thought that was really fascinating the way that they approached it because Craig Young has played a lot of snaps this year.
Yeah.
He's consistently in the top 3 or 4, right? It's usually kind of the 2 cornerbacks, and then it's kind of Craig and then Kenny when he's been more healthy. He's been banged up a little bit. And so I just look at the linebackers as a whole. I thought it was interesting how they rotated them. I thought those guys played really well and tackled really well overall. Obviously, Taiwan Berryhill got another sack on Saturday as well. And so I guess I'll let you kind of move wherever you want to go, Kevin. Is it linebackers? Is it defensive backs? Like what else on defense stood out to you? Because I think we can talk about every level.
Yeah, I thought bringing up the linebackers was great. Taiwan Berryhill has come so far over his time at Kansas, but even beyond that, Taiwan Berryhill has come so far over the last year. He is a guy that has really thrived under this Leipold staff, and it feels like game after game you're continuing to see him get better, and some of that comes with confidence, and everything else. But he's looking terrific out there. It cracked me up because coming out of the Tennessee Tech game, and I know we keep bringing that up, but it's the opener, and so we're saying where we were from there.
Exactly.
Kansas put Craig Young in some really tough spots in the first few games, and we talked about that and how Kansas was asking him to do an awful lot. Craig Young did an awful lot against Iowa State, and he did it well. And those were things that maybe in the first few games you watched it and you said, gosh, like they're asking him to do a lot. I remember seeing him in coverage on a wide receiver on the sideline at one point where he was the primary coverage guy. And then, he's proven to be a really good blitzer and pass rusher with his athleticism. And so when you look at all the different things that they're asking him to do, it seems like week by week now, your return on Craig Young is starting to get bigger and bigger. Also, the cornerbacks, I thought they played well physically. I did think, and that was a major question. But in terms of how big certain plays were, how about Kenny Logan breaking up the pass in the end zone? I mean, that was just a humongous play, and it feels like you said, Kenny's been a little bit banged up, but it feels like he's maybe starting to assert himself and show a little bit more week to week now too. And to have that level player on the back end really, really helps. I think cornerback is still probably, if you were to say this defense has a weak spot, I think you would look at cornerback. But I think safety, they've got a few different guys that they like there, and the linebacker group is just getting better week by week. But again, I hate to, just roll everything back, but the defensive line, just if it plays like that, then even if the offense isn't perfect, it's going to give Kansas a chance to win.
Exactly. Again, where does it start? It starts with stopping the run, and they only allowed one. You did your 5 earlier. I've got one for you. One explosive run all game.
Yeah,
that's all you can ask for, right? If you're gonna stop the run, make teams one-dimensional, and you can kind of scheme around it and try and give those cornerbacks some more help. So, I think overall, you look at this game and KU didn't play its best game, and we still keep saying that they're 5-0 and they've still not played their best game yet.
It was probably, let's just put this out there, it was probably Kansas's worst game of the year.
Yeah.
And it was Kansas's worst game of the year against arguably the best team that Kansas has played all year. And Kansas still found a way to win the football game. And so I think, it was touch and go for sure. But yeah, I mean, kudos to them for finding a way. I mean, they don't give wins back. They don't take them away because they're ugly. And so if you can find a way to win when you're not at your best, then that's certainly a good sign moving forward.
And I'll tell you who does give wins away: Matt Campbell. Like, you look at his record in one-score games. Iowa State has a terrible – so that 2020 season when Iowa State made the Big 12 title game, they won a lot of one-score games.
Yeah.
And then they blew teams out at the end of the year because they kind of were more dominant kind of teams stopped playing because COVID. They've been so awful in that. And that fourth down decision to not go for it on 4th and inches or whatever it was, 4th and 1, to try out the kicker that had already hit. He doinked – like I tweeted out today, right? There's a double doink in the NFL this morning.
Yeah.
And what's more impressive, a double doink on one kick or hitting both uprights on separate kicks in the same game?
Going different directions.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, and I agree with you. And in that case, friend of the show, I guess we would call him, Scott Chasen. One of the things that he had said was that he tweeted out was about the win probability, right? Because if you kick the field goal and you make it, you're still tied.
Yeah, overtime.
Kansas still has a chance to potentially win it in regulation.
True.
And Kansas can still win it in overtime. Whereas if you go for it and you get it, you've got a chance to win in regulation, take things out of Kansas's hands. I thought that was not a great decision, especially, even before the benefit of hindsight, especially with, the whole hashtag college kickers, deal. But at the same time, like, that kid did not look like he wanted to take that kick, Michael.
He's a freshman.
He is a freshman, but I mean, even trotting out there, I was watching the game with my wife, and I was like, he's gonna miss this. You just looked at it, and he didn't look like he wanted to be out there. I am interested. I got to ask you a question. Did Kansas touch the kick? Because there's some people wondering, based on, to use a line from the movie Major League, the trajectory of the ball, it comes up and then it kind of sputters out and goes down.
It was a shank.
It could be that he just shanked it that badly, or it could be that maybe somebody got a finger on. I know somebody tweeted, and I'm sorry that I'm not putting your Twitter name up here, because I would love to give you credit for it, because I think it's an interesting theory. Somebody who was at the game said that they thought they heard the sound of somebody's hand hitting the ball after it was kicked. So I don't know if it was blocked or not. The reason I was asking you is, you being there in the post game, nobody mentioned that, right? Like, nobody said like, oh yeah, well, I blocked that, or the coaches said, hey, that was blocked. They just said it was missed, right?
Yeah, and so I love you mentioned that, because I talked to Rich Miller about it, and Rich was on the field for that play. he didn't mention that he thought it got blocked. What he said was he knew that all game that, again, we're going to go back to the defensive line group. Those guys up front were getting a huge push. And I think you've seen that all season from that special teams. And again, we're talking about special teams being a plus for Kansas, right? And that's huge. You won this game based on special teams, right? There's the muff punt. There's the kick return from Sevion Morrison. There's this as well. And so the special teams are good. And I think that those guys got to push up front. I didn't see if it got tipped. The official stats, I just pulled it up, doesn't list it as being tipped. But if someone there in the stadium says they saw it got tipped, I'm in the press box. Like, my angle is not the best on that. And I haven't seen a TV angle yet that makes me feel that way. But that's
it might have just been that it was shanked. But I know Sam Burt got a really big push on that play. And I think it was Jeremy Robinson. I'm not saying he touched it, but his hand was right about in the path of where the ball seemed like it was starting. And then it kind of spun out and went the other way. So I'm interested to see, because obviously we don't get the best view on TV. We're stuck on whatever they show. And it might have been that he just, absolutely shanked the heck out of it. This is a family show. But at the same time, I did think that was an interesting theory. And I thought it was interesting that the guy said, being in the stadium, he thought he heard contact on the ball when it was right after it was kicked. So kind of a fun little deal. But no, I mean, I didn't even, when I first watched it, I was just like, I can't believe how badly he shanked that.
You feel bad for him. That's all I gotta say. He's a freshman. That's one of the things that Iowa State should got on transfer, but we're not an Iowa State podcast, as we've said. Okay, question time. We've answered one of them before. This is more fun stuff. I think we've talked enough about just the game itself and what it means. Let's start here. I thought it was really good from Frank Saunders on Twitter. Pick one player from the last 13 years who deserves to reap the rewards in 2022. You can go first because I'll do the next one.
Okay, so as much as selfishly I would love to see Puka Williams running the ball behind an offensive line that would block for him, I think the answer is probably somewhere on defense. And I really looked at offense too. Tony Pearson was a thought that I had, just because I think Andy Kotelnicki would love to have a back running 4-3 that he could, give the ball to on jet sweeps and, run in different motions and do all sorts of things like that. If he felt like the receiver core could add somebody like Steven Sims, obviously that would be a big deal. Steven Sims was open quite a bit. I looked a lot at Dorrance Armstrong because I said, if you've got Lonnie Phelps on one side and you've got Dorrance Armstrong, as a first-team All Big 12 pass rusher on the other side, you're cooking. I mean, people are going to be in trouble. I also looked at Daniel Wise because I said, if you put Daniel Wise next to Caleb Sampson, you're again looking at something where you've got potentially two All Big 12 defensive tackles. At the same time, I think that group has played so well, and I think the defensive ends are starting to come on. And so the guy that I ultimately settled on, most people would say this is not the best player. And I know you're going to talk about a couple guys who got All Big 12 mention and everything else. Ja'Cory Shepherd, I think, is the guy that I would have picked. As a cover corner, he was terrific. Technically speaking, if we're being honest, Chris Harris does fall into. So you could take Chris Harris. I thought
if they had Chris Harris,
as good as Chris Harris was at Kansas, I didn't think he was quite as good as like a number one corner in college. I thought that he really did a great job in the pros of kind of finding his role. Ja'Cory Shepherd was a number one corner and was really good at it, and was a guy that had the hips, that he could play physically if he needed to. He was somebody that could run with fast receivers down the field. And so I think to give Kansas sort of a cornerback one like that, Ja'Cory Shepherd would be my pick. After naming off like 8 different guys, Ja'Cory Shepherd would be my pick. How about you?
It's one guy. It's Joe Deneen. Joe Deneen. I think you look at him, Lawrence native, really bled for the team, carried the defense. Like he led the NCAA in tackles, and I think he almost did it back-to-back seasons. I can't remember the second year. I look at him and I say that's the guy that dealt with all the crap and had to go through it. And I'll never. This is one of my memories of talking to Joe after games. There was that Iowa State game in 2018. I think it might have been senior day. There were barely any KU fans there, and I don't blame them. Right? I think we've talked about this before. Like I don't blame fans that don't show up for bad football and incompetent football. I don't blame them. But it was all Iowa State fans. It was all Iowa State fans. And I remember Joe sitting there after the game, and you could just tell how much that pissed him off and how much that upset him as someone that's a local guy that carried the defense to have something like that. And I can't remember if it was senior day. Maybe I'm wrong, but that was one of those moments where you're like, man, the player deserves better. And so that's what's really stuck with me. Thinking, obviously my frame of reference is a little more short term. I would say Hakeem Adeniji too, honestly, because he was really
he would have been terrific. Like
and you put him I like
he was good anyway, but he would have been terrific in this system. And
and I like Calvert, and Calvert's good, but all of a sudden, if you're looking at you put Earl Bostic at right tackle, and you've got Hakeem at left tackle, all of a sudden you're looking at two tackles that are like top half of the Big 12. I mean, dang, Hakeem was the starting guard on a team that went to the Super Bowl. Like, I mean, it's just impressive. And so I think that Hakeem's another one of those guys that was always so you could tell how much KU meant to him. And I think that's what I think of when I think of these guys. It's the guys who you could tell that the school pride meant a lot. That'd be cool to see them reap the rewards of the field being stormed for a second straight week, or going on an ESPN interview on Sports Center, right? Obviously, Jalen Daniels is the guy that's been doing that, but if you got a star guy like Hakeem or a guy like Joe, who are really good faces of your program, he could be out there doing it too. So I think those are the two that I go with. All right, so let's move on. Why is Kansas not going to lose the final 7 like the last 5-0 Kansas team did? I'll tell you what, don't look at the schedule. The schedule, your games are getting tougher. Why won't they? Because I do think the offense is legit, and you're not playing Iowa State every week. I think Iowa State is kind of the kryptonite almost for what Kansas is as a team. You just look at them controlling the clock, controlling the ball. They have the defense to do so. And I just look at the rest of the Big 12, like TCU can't do that. Texas can't do that. Texas Tech can't do that. Kansas State can't do that. And so right there, those are the games that I look at as being kind of your winnable games to get you to bowl eligibility. I do think some losses are coming. It just is going to happen. But I'll tell you what, Oklahoma doesn't scare you as much as it did when you're looking at it on paper at the beginning of the season. Texas is the same. They're so hot and cold, and just who the heck knows what version of that team is going to show up. I still am of the belief that's probably a loss, but still, I just think that this is a team that with the offense that they have is just going to keep them in games. And we keep talking about coin flip games and coin flip moments on this podcast. And Saturday against Iowa State was exactly that. It was a game with just a ton of coin flips, and more of the flips went Kansas's way than Iowa State's way. And with the offense KU has, there will be more and more times throughout the season when that happens. And I guarantee you once they will get the coin flips, if not 2 or more times. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm actually going to approach this from the other angle because I covered the 2009 team. And I think one of the things that people forget is disaster just struck with that team. Jake Sharp had a really hot start to the year, and I think he broke his leg. I mean, he missed like a really significant portion of the year. So that was a problem. The 6th game, I believe, the first loss out of that group was at Colorado, and about 5 things had to go wrong for Kansas to lose that game, including but not limited to Kansas threw the game-winning touchdown and got hit on like a pick play call that was a really like not a great call. So that was one loss. Then Todd Reesing, pulls his groin, And so all of a sudden, not only do you not have potentially an all Big 12 running back in Jake Sharp, your quarterback is playing with a groin injury. So you're not running the ball as effectively. Your quarterback isn't really able to be himself in the ways that Todd Reesing was able to be. And credit to Todd. I mean, I've read his book. I've talked to him once or twice since he played, and he never blamed the groin injury for his issues, but it was apparent for anybody who saw it. And then you add in the last part of that, which was the accusations against Mark Mangino that came out as the season was still going on. Is Mark Mangino in trouble? What are the players saying? What are they doing? Players having to answer those questions at press conferences and things like that. And so it was kind of a perfect storm to go from 5-0 to 0-7 over the last few games. And so I guess when looking at this year's team, now I tweeted out, there's nothing more dangerous in this world than a group of 18 to 22-year-olds with confidence.
Yes.
And Kansas has a lot of confidence right now. And so you can't go into that locker room and tell them, gosh, guys, I don't know if you're going to beat TCU. No, those guys are sitting there. They're thinking, who's TCU? Why wouldn't we beat TCU? Why wouldn't we beat Oklahoma? Why wouldn't we beat whoever else? And so I think in order to go from 5-0 to 0-7, like that 2009 team does, you have to kind of have lightning strike the same spot about 5 different times. And that was what happened in that season. Whereas I think that Kansas this year, like you said, the offense, I think, is legitimate. I think Jalen had an off game. And I think that Iowa State was able to challenge him in some ways that led to that. I'm not saying that it was independent of Iowa State, but I do think that Jalen's going to get back on track. I think that they're going to have other big offensive performances. And I think you've got a locker room that's really feeling confident right now, that they feel like they should be winning. And when you have all of those things, provided you don't have all of the different things that derailed that 2009 team, and, I'm knocking on wood to make sure, that stuff doesn't happen. But I don't see all of those things going wrong to where Kansas just all of a sudden falls apart at this point in the season.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I think it's a really good way to highlight it. All right, and last one. Let's wrap it up here with this.
Sure.
Game day, hot topic. Who's going to be the guest picker? I think there's a good group you could pick from. I'll let you go first.
So if I am the University of Kansas, if you put me in Travis Goff's shoes, and Travis, I hope you're watching, I would go get Jason Sudeikis, because I think the biggest thing out there right now is Ted Lasso. You're in this situation where I think it could be really fun. You're in a place where College Game Day doesn't usually go, right? And so things are a little bit unorthodox. And if Jason Sudeikis were to show up and not just pick as Jason Sudeikis, but pick games as Ted Lasso, as an American football coach, coaching European football, I think it would be really memorable. And I think that it would be really funny and great. I know, Sudeikis wouldn't, if we were putting Las Vegas odds on this, I don't know that Sudeikis would be the favorite, even though that would be, who I would choose. Obviously, you could go Paul Rudd. Paul Rudd's terrific. I'm guessing it's probably going to be Rob Riggle, with how often Rob is around it. And Rob's hysterical and great and all of those different things. But if it were me, with how popular Ted Lasso is, with all of the different things there, like I said, I think there's a chance where if you could get Jason Sudeikis to come back and possibly do it as Ted Lasso, I think it would make for a really memorable College Game Day experience. What do you think, Michael?
That'd be a good bit. That'd be an enjoyable bit. I'm gonna go the other way. Actually, I'm gonna say this: don't have it be Bill Self.
Yeah,
I have a feeling, and that's they're coming out of a national title. I understand it if they go that way, but don't let KU football be KU football.
Sure.
Right? Don't try and take away and say, hey, basketball got a national title. Yes, they did. And it's good for the program that they did, right? Exciting. It was great to cover. Let this moment in KU football history be KU football's moment. That's my biggest thing that I pick. I think you kind of name the options. I think it will be Rob Riggle. If you made me put down $20 in DraftKings or FanDuel or pick or we're Caesars Sportsbook online, whatever,
There you go.
it's
There you go.
sponsored 24/7. I would put money on Riggle because he's around. He does a lot of this stuff in terms of being a front-facing alumni. I think it'll be him, but I'll tell you what, excited to cover it. I got to cover it at Iowa State last year, and it's a fun event to cover. Obviously, we'll have plenty of coverage of that all week. As always, thank you to everyone for listening to the Fog.net podcast. We always have a lot of fun with these Sunday shows. Stay tuned to the website all week. Plenty of content coming your way. I've got my kind of good, bad, and interesting story for VIP subscribers coming out. We'll have some recruiting updates as well this week, and there's just going to be a lot of stuff going on with Game Day. There's going to be some media availabilities that are extra, talking to some of those Game Day crew as well. So really exciting week ahead. And as always, let's see if I can get this right this time. If you're listening on the podcast apps, head over to YouTube, The Fog. Make sure you subscribe and like, and you'll see the video content we're doing there. If you're watching this on YouTube, head over to your podcast platform of choice and look up the Fog.net podcast. Hit that subscribe button. You'll be alerted every time that we have an episode coming out. We'll have another midweek episode covering TCU, what to expect. But until then, have a good start to everyone's week.